At 10 o'clock on the morning of August 23, 1948, Ed Schoch was not gripping a control stick. He was suspended in darkness inside a bomber's open belly. 25,000 feet above the California desert, he sat inside a cramped metal pod hanging from a steel hook, swaying in the slipstream like meat in a cold storage locker. The noise outside was brutal. Wind battered the thin aluminum shell, a constant metallic howl that rattled through the frame and into his bones. Schoch was not the pilot in command of an aircraft. He was freight. Strapped into the XF-85 Goblin, he felt less like a fighter ace and more like cargo waiting to be unloaded. The machine did not resemble any warplane anyone respected. It looked unstable, almost absurd, like something torn from an amusement park ride and bolted to a jet engine. There were no wheels tucked beneath it. No landing gear waited to deploy. The entire craft hung from a single latch under a bomber's fuselage, dangling over empty air. If that latch failed, he would drop 5 miles inside a powerless metal shell. There would be no recovery. Schoch glanced at his gauges. The cockpit was so tight that his shoulders pressed against the fuselage walls on both sides. Official documents called this the next step in aerial combat. Engineers praised it as the final answer to the Air Force's greatest vulnerability. Schoch knew better. He had heard the laughter in the mess hall. They called it the flying pickle. Some preferred the egg. They studied its short wings and swollen body and treated it like a joke. No one there believed it was a real fighter. To them, it was a one-way capsule, a coffin with a jet attached. Schoch tilted his head and looked through the canopy. Above him stretched the polished silver underside of the bomber carrying him. The B-29 filled his view like a moving sky. He felt like a parasite clinging to something far larger, a tick on a hound. In less than 2 minutes, that hound would shake him loose. To understand why a rational man would agree to be released from a bomb bay in a jet-powered egg, you have to look at the world map in 1948. The Second World War had ended, but tension had not. The Cold War was beginning to harden. America's new rival was the Soviet Union. Distance was the enemy. The Soviet heartland lay thousands of miles away. Any mission to strike Moscow with an atomic weapon required crossing oceans, passing over Europe, and penetrating deep into hostile airspace. To make that possible, they built the B-36 Peacemaker. It was enormous. The Peacemaker became the largest mass-produced piston-engine aircraft ever constructed. Its size was so extreme that crews joked they did not pilot it, they merely chose where it might eventually come down. It carried 6 massive propeller engines and 4 additional jet engines. Its wingspan exceeded the length of the Wright brothers' first powered flight. It could remain airborne for 40 hours without refueling. But it had one fatal weakness. It would be alone. The B-36 could travel 10,000 miles, yet no fighter in existence could escort it for that distance. Early jets, such as the F-80 Shooting Star, burned fuel at a staggering rate. They could stay airborne for an hour, perhaps 2, before their tanks ran dry. If a Peacemaker crossed into Soviet territory, it would do so without protection. The generals had not forgotten 1943. They remembered what happened when B-17 flying fortresses went over Germany without escort. The Luftwaffe tore into them and destroyed them in formation. Unprotected bombers became slaughter. Military planners understood that an unescorted B-36 would be nothing more than a slow, oversized target for Soviet MiG fighters. They needed a Guardian that could cover 4,000 miles. Engineers ran into hard limits. A fighter could not carry enough fuel to match that range without becoming too heavy to fight effectively. Add the fuel, lose the agility. It was a simple equation that refused to balance. Then someone proposed a solution that sounded absurd. If the fighter could not accompany the bomber, it would ride inside it. The B-36 was vast. Its bomb bay was long enough to resemble a railcar. The concept was to design a compact, aggressive jet with folding wings, small enough to stow inside the Peacemaker's belly for hours. When enemy interceptors appeared, the bomber would open its doors, lower the fighter into the slipstream, and release it. The tiny jet would engage the attackers, then return, hook onto a trapeze mechanism, and be reeled back into the bomb bay for the trip home. On paper, it was flawless. It read like science fiction. The Air Force awarded the project to the McDonnell Aircraft Corporation. Their instructions were strict. Build a parasite fighter. It had to fit inside a standard bomb bay. Its length could not exceed 15 feet. With wings folded, its width had to remain under 5 feet. It was as if someone had demanded a high-performance sports car small enough to pack into luggage. The engineers delivered the XF-85 Goblin. When it emerged from the hangar, there was no applause. There was silence. The aircraft was unlike anything anyone had seen. It barely stretched 15 feet from nose to tail. Its fuselage resembled a truncated teardrop. The pilot's seat sat directly above the jet engine intake. The tail ended in an unusual triple fin arrangement that looked almost forked. The wings swept backward and folded upward when stowed, like a bird settling onto a wire. Yet the most unsettling feature was the absence of something fundamental. There were no wheels, no landing skids, no backup gear. The underside was smooth metal from nose to tail. This aircraft was never meant to touch Earth. It belonged in the air. Its hangar was a bomb bay. If it failed to reconnect with the bomber, there was no runway waiting. It would fall. Pilots saw it for what it was in their eyes, a machine with no room for error. A single mistake meant death. The ridicule began immediately. At Muroc Air Force Base, test pilots prided themselves on flying large, powerful aircraft armed with serious firepower. They were masters of heavy sticks and fast machines. They looked at the Goblin and saw a novelty, a toy. Some joked you needed to drop a coin into it before it would move. Others asked whether a prize came inside. They nicknamed it the Bumblebee, saying that by every aerodynamic rule, it had no business leaving the ground. It was stubby and thick through the middle. It looked wrong. Out on the flight line, the general opinion was simple. The Goblin was an expensive punchline. No one wanted their name attached to a flying egg. Except Ed Schoch. Schoch kept to himself. He was not loud, not flashy. He had flown Hellcats over the Pacific with the Navy. He understood combat and risk. When he studied the Goblin, he did not see a toy. He saw raw potential. A pilot strapped to a jet engine. Its size meant a smaller target. No landing gear, no heavy fuel load for long-range cruising, less weight. While others joked about its shape, Schoch read the numbers carefully. A Westinghouse turbojet, 600 miles per hour, for 50 caliber machine guns. Not a novelty. A compact weapon. A projectile with a cockpit. He stepped forward and volunteered. He told the McDonnell engineers he would fly it. They were grateful, but nervous. The calculations said it could fly. The real fear was the docking system. A long trapeze arm would extend from the bomber's bomb bay. At its end hung a metal ring. The Goblin carried a retractable hook in its nose. To reconnect, Schoch would need to approach from behind at 200 miles per hour and guide that hook cleanly into the eyelet. The tolerance was less than 6 inches. Too high and his canopy would smash into the bomber's belly. Too low and the slipstream would knock him away. Too wide and he might tear off a wing. All of this while wrestling the turbulence thrown off by the bomber's massive propellers. Schoch spent long hours sitting in the cramped cockpit on the hangar floor. He rehearsed every step. Release. Engine start. Approach. Hook. He tuned out the jokes. He ignored the pilots who asked if he had brought a school lunch. He focused on what mattered. If this concept worked, it would change strategic warfare. B-36 bombers could carry entire flocks of these fighters. They could deploy protection anywhere in the world. But first, the Goblin had to prove it could fly. For the initial test, they used a modified B-29 Superfortress as the carrier aircraft. The crew called it Monstro, like the whale in Pinocchio. The Goblin was winched up into the bomb bay. Schoch climbed inside. The bay doors shut. Darkness closed around him. As the bomber rolled down the taxiway, every vibration traveled through the hook and into his body. He hung there, swaying slightly. Tight, confined, and suspended in the dark. He checked oxygen flow, radio, instruments. The bomber accelerated and lifted off. He watched his wrist altimeter. 10,000 feet. 15. 20,000. The air thinned and turned bitter cold. The Goblin's heaters hummed steadily. At 25,000 feet, the Monstro pilot called back over the radio. It was time. Schoch cinched his harness tighter. His hand rested on the release lever. Hydraulics whined. The bomb bay doors opened with a metallic groan. Light flooded the cockpit, blinding after the darkness. Then came the wind. The trapeze arm lowered him into open air. He now hung fully outside the bomber, suspended over the desert. The slipstream slammed into the Goblin. It shuddered violently. He glanced down. The desert floor lay miles below. Ahead, the nose pointed straight at the horizon. Some experts had predicted it would tumble out of control. Others called the whole concept insane. Schoch inhaled slowly. He ignored them all. He flipped the ignition switch. Then he pulled the release handle. The hook disengaged. The Goblin dropped instantly, falling away from the bomber like a rock. For a split second, there was weightlessness. The B-29 surged upward and vanished from view, replaced by harsh sunlight and the vast Mojave stretching below. This was the critical moment. If the engine failed, he would not be a pilot. He would be a passenger in a falling coffin. The wind screamed across the canopy. He did not hesitate. Just as practiced, he pushed the throttle forward after hitting the ignition. The Westinghouse engine behind him came alive in an instant. No hesitation. No sputter. A sharp mechanical howl filled the cockpit. Thrust slammed him back into his seat. The fall stopped. The small, egg-shaped aircraft transitioned from dropping to flying. The short wings caught the air. He eased back on the stick. The Goblin responded immediately, climbing in a tight arc. In that moment, the laughter back at the mess hall disappeared. The flying pickle was airborne. He advanced the throttle fully. Airspeed climbed through 200, 300, then 400 miles per hour. The aircraft felt quick and responsive. Not like a lumbering escort, but like a compact predator. He banked sharply left, pulling heavy G-forces. A conventional fighter might have protested. The Goblin held firm. For the next 20 minutes, Schoch tested it hard. He pulled it through loops. He rolled it cleanly through the sky. He pushed the nose down toward the desert and yanked it back up at the last possible second. It was not just a maneuver. It was a statement to everyone who had laughed. The idea worked. This was not some novelty hanging under a bomber. It was dangerous. You could picture Soviet MiGs trying to track it. The Goblin was so small it would slip into view only when it was already behind them. A compact ambush fighter. From the B-29 above, the crew watched the tiny shape slicing through the sky around them. They knew they were watching something unprecedented. The radio chatter carried excitement. The first phase had succeeded, but staying airborne had never been the real test. The fuel needle was already sliding down. The jet engine consumed fuel quickly. Half the tank was gone. It was time to return. Monstro, this is Goblin. Requesting docking clearance. The thrill drained from the cockpit. Focus replaced it. Taking off had been simple. Landing required perfection. He needed to slide in behind the bomber, match its speed exactly, and guide the nose hook into a metal loop hanging from the trapeze. The loop was 14 inches across. Both aircraft were moving at 200 miles per hour, for miles above the ground. It was like threading a needle while strapped to a roller coaster. He positioned himself behind the B-29. The bomber looked enormous ahead of him, steady and silver. The trapeze arm extended downward. The ring at its end looked absurdly small. As he closed in, the smooth air vanished. He hit the wake. Pilots called it the burble. The bomber displaced a massive volume of air, and that air wrapped around its body in violent, swirling currents. When the lightweight Goblin entered that disturbed flow, stability disappeared. The aircraft began to buck. He fought the stick. The nose wandered. One moment he was centered. The next, an invisible shove pushed him sideways. He adjusted power, added throttle, pulled it back. He balanced on the edge of control. 50 feet. 40. The ring swayed ahead of him. He could see the yellow paint on it now. 20 feet. The turbulence intensified. The Goblin shuddered hard. He pushed forward with a short burst of throttle to close the gap. The hook stretched toward the loop. An updraft caught him. The aircraft jumped upward. The hook struck the trapeze arm instead of the ring with a harsh metallic bang. He cut power and dropped away quickly to avoid hitting the bomber. Back in clean air, his pulse pounded in his ears. Missed approach, he said calmly over the radio, though sweat ran inside his gloves. The engineers told him to try again. They suggested his angle was wrong. Maybe too much speed. He understood the real problem. The Goblin was too light. The air was throwing it around. He set up for another attempt, approaching from slightly lower, hoping to avoid the worst propeller wash. He crept forward slowly, correcting constantly. The controls felt alive, twitching in his hands. The plane wanted to roll and yaw unpredictably. He forced himself not to back off. He edged closer. The trapeze hung above him. He could see grease stains at its joints. He steadied the nose, held his breath, nudged forward. The hook made contact. For a split second he thought it had caught. It had not. The ring slipped away. The impact jolted the aircraft. The nose dropped sharply. He hauled the stick back, pulled away again, frustration rising. The fuel gauge had reached the red zone. Time was disappearing, perhaps 10 minutes before the engine starved. On the third approach, fatigue set in. His arms were sore from fighting the controls. The air behind the bomber felt even more violent. The cruise instructions came through his headset, but he filtered them out. He locked his eyes on the ring. This time he came in faster, trying to force his way through the turbulence with momentum. 10 feet. 5. 2. Another surge of disturbed air slammed into him. The Goblin shot upward. Instead of slipping into the ring, the nose climbed past it. The heavy trapeze structure struck the canopy directly. The sound cracked through the cockpit like a gunshot. Plexiglass shattered. The blow ripped his helmet off instantly. Wind exploded into the cockpit at 200 miles per hour, along with shards of broken canopy. He was blinded. Air roared against his face. He could not see. He could barely hear. The impact had torn the nose hook away completely. The docking system was gone. The aircraft rolled and began to spin thousands of feet above the desert. The canopy was destroyed. There were no wheels. No backup landing gear. No helmet. The parasite fighter had become exactly what the critics had predicted. He reached blindly for the control stick. He forced his eyes open against the blast of wind tearing into the cockpit. The horizon was spinning wildly. He slammed the rudder pedal, kicking the aircraft into a hard skid to break the rotation. The Goblin responded, wobbling and shaking before finally leveling out. The vibration ran through the frame. Schoch wiped blood from his face and looked up. Far above, the B-29 circled, a small silver shape against the sky. He glanced at the nose of his aircraft. The hook was gone, completely torn away. There would be no docking, no return to the bomb bay. He was on his own. He checked the fuel gauge. It was empty. The engine coughed once, choked on the last fumes, and went silent. The sudden quiet felt worse than the wind had. He was now gliding in a machine never meant to glide. The Goblin had the glide performance of a toolbox. It was designed to be carried, not to soar. He was descending at 3,000 feet per minute. Two choices remained. He could eject. He could fire the seat, jump, and trust the parachute. That was procedure. The manual was clear. The airplane was experimental, replaceable. The pilot was not. He looked down at the desert racing upward. He saw the wide, flat, dry lake bed at Muroc. Hard ground, long and open. The ground rushed up at 170 miles per hour. He could abandon the aircraft and end the program, or he could try to land it. If the Goblin disintegrated into a burning crater, the critics would be right. He grabbed the radio microphone, shouting over the wind pouring into the shattered cockpit. "Monstro, I am taking it in. Belly landing." The response from above was immediate. They told him to eject. You do not land a jet without wheels. You crash it. The Goblin had no skid plate. Its underside was thin aluminum that would tear open the instant it touched the ground. Friction could turn it into a fireball. He ignored them. He lined up with the lake bed. He was fast. Without power, he could not bleed off speed easily. The wings needed airflow to stay alive. 170 miles per hour. The desert surface blurred beneath him. He saw cracks in the dry earth. 10 feet above the ground. He raised the nose gently, trying to hold it off, trying to buy a second more. The stall warning screamed. The aircraft shuddered and then dropped. The Goblin struck the ground at roughly 150 miles per hour. It did not roll. It slid. The sound was violent, metal grinding against packed earth. A thick cloud of brown dust erupted behind him, rising high into the air. Strapped in, Schoch felt his body rattle so violently that his vision blurred. Heat built instantly along the belly of the aircraft as the aluminum skin buckled and tore against the dirt. The plane yawed sharply left, threatening to dig in a wingtip and flip. He stomped the rudder pedals, fighting to keep it straight. It was like riding a metal sled across sandpaper. The slide continued for nearly a mile. It felt endless. Finally, the momentum bled away. The aircraft shuddered to a stop. Silence settled over the desert. Rescue vehicles were already racing across the lake bed, sirens cutting through the still air. They expected flames. They expected wreckage and worse. Before they reached him, the canopy frame moved. Schoch pushed it open and climbed out. Dust covered him. Blood marked his face from the earlier canopy impact. His hands shook as the adrenaline drained, but he was standing. He stepped onto the damaged wing and lit a cigarette. He looked at the underside of the aircraft. It was shredded. The intake was packed with dirt. The airplane was ruined. But the pilot was alive. Most programs would have ended that day. A multi-million-dollar prototype lay mangled on the lake bed. The docking system had nearly killed its pilot. It was a perfect reason to cancel everything. But this was 1948. Fear of Soviet bombers outweighed fear of risk. The generals did not want retreat. They wanted a workable parasite fighter. The Goblin was repaired, dents hammered out, a new canopy installed. 7 weeks later, they asked Schoch if he would try again. He did not hesitate. He climbed back into the bomb bay. He was not motivated by money. He was driven by professionalism. The problem had not been solved. The next series of tests was the real fight. The first flight had exposed the weakness. The following flights would be a sustained struggle. Engineers believed they had identified the cause. They blamed the turbulence on the hook design. They adjusted shapes, modified the trapeze, refined the aerodynamics. They promised him it would be better. It was not. Each launch was smooth. Once clear of the bomber, the Goblin was quick and precise, exactly as advertised. Every attempt to return was chaos. Schoch began to understand the pattern. It was more than general turbulence. It was a specific aerodynamic effect known as the burble. As the small fighter approached the massive belly of the bomber, airflow between the two aircraft accelerated. The pressure dropped. The space between them acted like a vacuum. It pulled the Goblin upward. Schoch would settle into position behind the bomber, steady on speed and alignment, and without warning the aircraft would lurch upward, drag toward the bomber's belly. He would shove the stick forward to counter it, only to cross some unseen boundary where the airflow flipped, hammering the nose down. One moment he was being sucked upward, the next he was being slammed downward. It was like wrestling a giant hand made of air. In October, the battle with that invisible force reached its worst point. On one flight, he made 3 separate attempts to dock. On the first pass, the suction effect grabbed the Goblin and hurled it upward so violently that his vertical stabilizer nearly clipped the bomb bay doors. He broke away breathing hard, sweat running down his back, arms aching from forcing the hydraulic controls against the air. He circled wide and tried again. This time the burble hit from the side. Without any command from him, the aircraft rolled 40 degrees to the right. He had to slam the stick fully left just to keep the wings from dropping further. He was trying to guide a fighter through a storm created by the very bomber he was protecting. The third attempt felt perfect. He anticipated the upward pull. He corrected for the roll before it developed. He closed in with precision. The nose hook struck the trapeze eyelet cleanly. There was a metallic click. Contact. Someone called over the radio. For a brief, shining second, it worked. The Goblin hung there, attached. Then momentum betrayed them. The speeds of the two aircraft were not perfectly matched. The Goblin swung forward on its pivot point, carrying excess energy. The trapeze arm snapped back. Metal slammed into metal. The latch failed. The Goblin dropped free again, falling back into the slipstream. His stomach rose into his throat as gravity reclaimed him. He rammed the throttle forward, relit the engine, and arrested the fall. He cursed into his oxygen mask. He had flown it correctly. The machine simply could not absorb the forces involved. 2 aircraft moving at 200 miles per hour, trying to join through a single steel connection, generated impacts like repeated car crashes. Over and over. Schoch was drained. He had accumulated more time in the parasite fighter than anyone else alive, and most of it had been spent gripping the controls, fighting not to die. The engineers began to study the data more closely. They stopped focusing on courage and started focusing on numbers. The suction and pressure reversal between the two aircraft were not minor inconveniences. They were structural, unavoidable aerodynamic effects. The B-36 created such a massive wake that it trailed a churning vortex behind it. Expecting a pilot to fly a 3-ton aircraft into the center of that wake and thread a hook into a ring was not a combat solution. It was a stunt, and even under ideal conditions, it succeeded only occasionally. In wartime, with a fatigued or wounded pilot, the odds would collapse. Schoch completed 7 flights in total. He demonstrated that the Goblin could launch, maneuver, and fight. He also demonstrated, through bruises, broken canopy glass, and shredded aluminum, that it could not reliably return. The parasite concept was suffocating in the desert air. Senior officers reviewed the film. The Goblin bouncing off the trapeze, the canopy impact, the the belly landings. They did not see a breakthrough. They saw a system that might destroy its own pilots. The final blow to the project did not come from another crash. It came from shifting technology. While Schoch was risking his life in the so-called flying egg, aerial refueling was emerging. Tanker aircraft learned to transfer fuel to bombers in flight. Suddenly, long-range bombers no longer needed to carry their own escort. At the same time, fighter jets were improving. Larger fuel capacities and better performance meant they could travel farther and rendezvous midair. The very range problem the Goblin was meant to solve was fading away. The aircraft was becoming obsolete before it ever matured. Schoch did not concern himself with politics or procurement debates. He focused on the cockpit. On his final flight, he treated it as another test. He flew the required profiles, collected data, and when the docking attempt failed again, just as experience had taught him it would, he turned toward the dry lake bed. He knew the routine. He shut down the engine. He extended what little control surfaces he could to stabilize the descent. He planted his boots against the rudder pedals and watched the ground climb toward him. He did not pray. He concentrated. Keep the wings level. Hold it straight. The Goblin struck the desert one last time, sliding across the hard surface as a plume of dust rose behind it like a marker in the air. When the aircraft finally stopped, Schoch opened the cockpit and climbed out without ceremony. He did not turn to admire the battered machine. He walked away. His responsibility had been fulfilled. Reports would later describe aerodynamic instability, docking envelope limitations, and structural loading issues. Engineers would document the forces and calculate the margins. Schoch understood it more simply. You cannot argue with physics. You can design bold machines and push them to extremes, but the air will not bend to ambition. The Goblin was hauled back into a hangar, where it would sit quietly. It had failed, but it had failed spectacularly. The Goblin became a symbol of an era when the Air Force was willing to attempt almost anything in order to gain an advantage. It reflected a mindset that said, put a jet inside a bomber and test it in the real sky. And at the center of that experiment stood Ed Schoch, the pilot who stepped into that cramped metal capsule and accepted the risk without hesitation. The XF-85 did not end in an explosion. It ended on paper. In 1949, the Air Force officially terminated the project. There were no ceremonies and no dramatic announcements. Senior officers reviewed the costs, studied the reports from Muroc, and concluded that the flying egg demanded more than it delivered. The prototypes were stripped. Classified systems were removed. The engines came out. The machine guns that had never fired in combat were taken off. The two aircraft were rolled into a corner of a hangar, covered in canvas, and left there. They had become relics almost overnight. They answered a strategic problem that was already fading. For many pilots at Muroc, the cancellation brought relief. The Goblin had become an uneasy joke, a reminder of how far leadership had been willing to stretch. Watching it disappear felt like waking from a strange dream. The B-36 would continue flying, relying on altitude and, increasingly, on tanker aircraft that could refuel it in midair. The parasite concept was shelved. The notion of a bomber carrying its own fighters was filed away with other impractical ideas. For Schoch, the end came without fanfare. He did not tour lecture halls. He did not publish a memoir. He returned to work. He was a test pilot, and in that period of rapid aviation development, there was always another aircraft waiting. He climbed into new cockpits. He evaluated new prototypes. He advanced throttles and explored their limits. He understood the profession. In experimental flight, setbacks are data points. The Goblin had not failed because he lacked skill. It failed because the airflow around the bomber could not be controlled. Schoch did not grow old telling stories on a quiet porch. In 1951, only 2 years later, he was killed while testing a P-51 Mustang. He died the same way he had lived, pushing an aircraft to find its boundaries. He was 29. He did not die in the small jet that had made his name known within test circles. He died in a famous fighter, and because of that, his story often fades into the background. He is not remembered the way Chuck Yeager is remembered. His name does not appear in popular culture like Neil Armstrong's. But among those who understand test flying, he is respected deeply. When others looked at the XF-85 and laughed, Schoch saw a task. He treated it like work. He climbed into a machine that many considered absurd and demonstrated that, in the right hands, it could function. He proved that no matter how advanced the design, the pilot's judgment and reflexes remained critical. Today, visitors to the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio can see the Goblin suspended from the ceiling in the Cold War gallery. It appears small beside the massive bombers around it. It almost resembles a model airplane enlarged for display. It hangs there clean and restored. The scars from its belly landings have been repaired. The desert dust has long since been washed away. Looking at it now, it is difficult to imagine the violence of its testing. You do not hear the wind tearing through a shattered canopy. You do not see the dust plume rising from a dry lake bed. You do not feel the abrupt pull of the burble trying to flip the aircraft. The museum is quiet. The airplane is polished. That calm surface can hide the struggle that defined it. History tends to celebrate the aircraft that succeeded. We remember the Mustang, the Spitfire, the Phantom. We rarely dwell on the experiments that did not work. The Goblin represents a moment when ambition outpaced aerodynamic reality. It embodies the anxiety of the early Cold War, when fear of the next conflict drove bold, risky ideas. At that time, leaders were willing to suspend a man beneath a bomber at high altitude to see if it could change strategic balance. They considered turning a bomber into a kind of airborne carrier. The Goblin stands as a reminder that innovation is not always linear. Sometimes a path ends abruptly. Sometimes the lesson comes from a project that slides to a stop in the desert. The next time you see a photograph of a B-36, look beyond its size. Look at the bomb bay doors and imagine them opening. Picture the cold air rushing in. Picture a young test pilot sitting in darkness, waiting for release. He had no automated systems to manage the flight. No protective cushion beyond his own training. Only a control stick, a throttle, and confidence in his ability. The Goblin was a bold experiment. It did not succeed. The pilot inside it did. As long as his story is told, the sound of that Westinghouse engine is not entirely silent. The Parasite fighter did not win a war. It delivered a lesson. It showed that physics sets limits that courage cannot erase. It demonstrated that even in moments of fear and urgency, there are boundaries the air will not allow us to cross. And most importantly, it taught us that the bravest men aren't always the ones in the biggest planes. Sometimes the bravest man is the one in the smallest seat, holding the wildest ride, simply because someone had to do it.